Hello, sorry, I thought I'd try to make a more exciting entrance there. How are you guys doing? Everything's well here. First day back with the children today, so it was quite nice to be back to teaching. Felt like I wasn't in real life anymore. Just turn off my fan there. Right, I'm going to continue on with chapter 7 of Kensuke's Kingdom. So the last line was, I resigned myself to waiting. Our life together was always busy and regular as clockwork. Up at dawn and down the track a little way to bathe in the stream, where it tumbled cold and fresh out of the hillside into a great cauldron of smooth rocks. We would wash our sheets and clothes here too. He'd made me my own kimono by now, slapping and pounding them on the rocks before hanging them out to dry on the branch of a nearby tree. Breakfast was a thick, pulpy fruit juice, which seemed different every day, and bananas or coconut. I never tired of bananas, but very soon became sick of coconut. The mornings were spent either fishing in the shallows or fruit gathering in the forest. Sometimes, after a storm, we scoured the beach for more of his painting shells. Only the biggest and flattest would do, or for Flotsam to join the stack of wood at the back of the cave. There were 2 stacks, one clearly for firewood, the other, I supposed, reserved for his woodwork. Then it was home to the cave house for a lunch of raw fish, always delicious, and usually breadfruit, always bland and difficult to swallow. A short nap after lunch for both of us, and then he would settle down at his table to paint. As I watched, I became so engrossed that the failing light of evening always came too soon for me. We would cook a fish soup over the fire. Everything went in, heads and tails, a dozen different herbs. Kensuke wasted nothing, and there were always red bananas afterwards, all I could eat. I never went hungry. When summer was over, we would sit together at the mouth of the cave and watch the last of the sun drop into the sea. Then, without a word, he'd stand up. We would bow solemnly to one another, and he would unroll his sleeping mat and lead me to mine. To see Kensuke at his work was always a wonder to me. He was so intent, so concentrated in everything he did. Watching him paint was best of all. To begin with, he would only let me kneel beside him and watch. I could sense that in this too, he liked his privacy and that he did not want to be disturbed. On the table in front of him, he put out 3 saucers. 1 saucer of octopus ink for Kensuke. Octopuses were not just for eating. 1 saucer of water, and another for mixing. He always held his brush very upright and very steady in his hands. Fingers down one side, thumb on the other. He would kneel, bent over his work, his beard almost touching the shell he was painting. I think perhaps he was a little short-sighted. I would watch him for hours on end, marvelling at the delicacy of his work, at the sureness of his touch. Then one rainy afternoon, when it rained, how it rained! I found he'd set out a shell for me, my own 3 saucers and my own paintbrush. He took such a delight in teaching me, even my every clumsy attempt. I remember early on that I tried to paint the jellyfish that had attacked me. He laughed out loud at that, but not in a mocking way, rather in recognition, in memory, of what had brought us together. I always liked to draw, but from Kensuke I learned to love it, that to draw or to paint I had to observe well, and then set out the form of the picture in my head, and send it down my arm through the tip of the brush and onto the shell. He taught me all this entirety without speaking. He simply showed me. The evidence that he was a considerable craftsman was all around me. The cave house must have been entirely furnished by then. Fashioned mostly from Flotsam, the chest, the workbench itself, the shelves, the table. He must have made everything from the rush matting, the bamboo panelling, everything. And on close examination, I could see that it was all perfectly finished. No nails, no screws, just neat doweling. He used some form of glue where necessary, and sometimes twine as well. Ropes for tree climbing, fishing spears, fishing nets, and fishing rods were stacked in one corner, though I'd never seen him use the rods. Yet he had to have made them all. He'd made his own paintbrushes as well, and I was soon to find out how. Kensuke has a favourite orangutan, a large female he called Tomodachi, who would often come and sit by him to be groomed. Kensuke was grooming her one day, just outside the mouth of the cave house, when the other orangutans looking on, when I saw him, quite deliberately, pluck out the longest and darkest hairs from her back. He held them up to show me, grinning conspiratorially. But at the time I didn't really understand what he was up to. Later, I watched him at his work, bench trimming the hairs with his knife, dipping them into the sap I'd seen him tap from a tree that same morning, cutting out a short length of hollow bamboo, and then filling them with Tomodachi's hair. A day later, the glue had hardened, and he'd made a paintbrush. Kensuke had always found ways to satisfy his every need. We were silent at our painting one day, the rain thundering down onto the forest below, when he stopped, put down his paintbrush, and said very slowly, in a very measured way, as if he'd thought about how to say it for a very long time, "I teach you painting, Mika." This was the first time he'd ever called me by my name. "You teach me speak English. I want to speak English. You teach me." It was the beginning of an English lesson that was to last for months. Every day, dawn to dusk, I translated the world around him into English. We did what we had always done, but now I talked all the time, and he would echo every word, every phrase he wanted to. His brow would furrow with the effort of it. It was as if, by saying every word, he would simply swallow it into his brain. Once told, once practiced, he would rarely forget, and if he did, he was always very annoyed with himself. Sometimes, as I enunciated a new word, I noticed that his eyes would light up. He would be nodding and smiling, almost as if he recognized the word, as if he was greeting an old friend. He would repeat it again and again, savouring the sound of it, before committing it to memory for good. And of course, the more words he knew, the more he tried to experiment with them. Single words became clipped phrases, became entire sentences. His pronunciation, though, never did improve, however hard he tried. Michael was always Mika, sometimes Mika-san. Now at last we could talk more easily to one another. The long silence in which our friendship had been forged was over. It had never been a barrier between us, but it had been limiting. We were sitting by the cave mouth one sunset, when he said, "You see now if I understand, Mika-san. You tell me story of you, where you live, why you come here, my island. From baby to now, I listen." So I did. I told him about home, about my mother and father, about the brick factory closing, about football with Eddie and the Mudlarks, about the Peggy Sue, and our voyage around the world, about football in Brazil and lions in Africa, and spiders in Australia, about my mother being ill, about the night I fell overboard. "Very good. I understand. Very good," he said, when I had finished. "So football you like. When I little, I play football too. Very happy time, long ago, in Japan, in my home." He sat in silence for some moments. "You very long way from home, Mika-san. You very sad sometimes, I see. So, I make you happy. Tomorrow we go fishing, and maybe I tell you my story too. My story, your story, maybe same story now." The sun had suddenly gone. We stood up and bowed to one another. "Oyasumi nasai," he said. "Good night," I said. It was the only time of day he ever spoke Japanese, although he did sing in Japanese mostly. I had taught him 10 green bottles, which always made him laugh when he sang it. I loved his laugh. It was never loud, more than a prolonged chuckle, but it always warmed my heart. The next morning, he picked up 2 of his fishing rods and a net, and he led the way into the forest. "Today we catch big fish, Mika, not small fish," he announced. He was taking us to the part of the island where I had been washed up all those months before, but rarely had cause to visit since, because there was little to no fruit to be found there. We had to beat a difficult path, through the forest before joining a cliff path that wound its way down to a hidden sandy bay. As we emerged from the forest onto the beach, Stella ran off, bounding at once into the shallows, barking at me to play with her. Suddenly, Kensuke caught me by the arm. "You look, Mika-san. What do you see?" His eyes were full of mischief. I didn't know where I was supposed to be looking for. "Nothing here, yes?" "I very clever fellow. You watch. I show you." He made for the end of the beach, and I followed. Once there, he began to pull and tug at the undergrowth. To my surprise, it simply came away in his hands. I saw at first what looked like a log lying in the sand, but as he dragged away more branches, I saw that it was part of a boat, an outrigger, a long, wide dugout with a frame of outriggers on either side. It was covered in canvas, which he folded back very slowly, chuckling to himself as he did so. And there, lying in the bottom of the boat, beside a long oar, was my football. He reached in and tossed it to me. It was softer now, and much of the white leather was cracked and discoloured in places. But, in places, I could still just make out Eddie's name. Right. That's the end of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 will come to tomorrow, but in the meantime, have a good evening, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.